Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Archana Atmakuri, a research analyst at ISAS. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, I welcome you all to ISAS East Asia Institute joint panel discussion on deadly clash in the Himalayas, impact on India-China relations and geopolitics in Asia. Before we proceed with the event, we would like to request participants to mute your microphones and turn off your video throughout the session. Should you have any questions, please forward them via this chat to the moderator. This afternoon, we are delighted to have the following panelists with us. Dr. Lin An, Visiting Senior Research Fellow, East Asia Institute, NUS. Dr. Yogesh Joshi, Research Fellow at ISAS. Dr. Ryan Clark, Visiting Senior Research Fellow, East Asia Institute, NUS. Dr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead, Trade and Economics, ISAS. Professor C. Rajamohan, Director at ISAS, and also Professor Bert Hoffman, Director of the East Asia Institute. Professor Mohan will moderate the panel discussion. I will now hand over the floor to Professor Bert Hoffman for the opening remarks. Prof. Hoffman, over to you.
Thank you, Archana, and thank you all for joining us. We have already more than 60 people in the room. That is fantastic for this important debate. I have the easiest task this afternoon. I'm here to welcome you. I'm here to thank all of you, but also thank the South Asian Institute to work with us on this very important topic. And Professor Mohan and I, we have discussed, I think this is actually the first time that we work together on a seminar, so this is very long overdue. But especially so because this topic is of great interest because of the immediate issues that we have at hand. And I don't know why I get a phone now. The immediate issue that we have at hand, namely the clash in the Himalayas. But of course, the China-India relationship has been a very central relationship over the past 50 years in China, in Asia. Sorry about that. But it will also be the defining relationship for the next 50 years. China and India are already giants. By the end of this century, the projections are that China and India are #1 and #2 economically worldwide. And of course, observing that from Singapore, which is right in between the two giants, gives us a very good viewpoint, but it is also a little bit unnerving if then there is bigger tensions. And the tensions, frankly, they do coincide with big tensions between China and the US, and I think that's how we can understand at least part of this geopolitical incident. So without further ado, once again, I'd like to thank all of you to join, and I'd like to thank ISAS for joining us in working on this, and I hope we can work on this for the foreseeable future in research and deeper analysis. And with that, I hand over to Professor Rajamohan. Thank you.
Let me join Professor Hoffman in welcoming all of you for this afternoon's discussion here in Singapore on deadly clash, India-China conflict that has unfolded in recent weeks. As Professor Hoffman said, this is the first time that Institute of East Asian Studies and the Institute of South Asian Studies are working together. And certainly won't be the last. Both Bert and I are determined, I think we need to do more things together. And as China rises, the different parts of Asia come to integrate with each other. The dynamic in one region affects another. And then there is this kind of an intersection where India, China, there is a direct conflict or cooperation that has consequences for the whole region. So we have 4 wonderful panelists here. So I'm not going to take too much of your time at this stage, but I just want to mention 3 contextual points at this stage. One, I think the clash that happened a few weeks ago is really the first one in nearly more than 40 years that actually there's been a violence on the border. It is quite significant because the crises have happened frequently, but this is really first time the clash has actually produced violence and deaths, at least 20 on the Indian side and unspecified number on the Chinese side. So this is something, it kind of nearly, since Rajiv Gandhi, Indian Prime Minister, went to China in 1988, there was relative peace and tranquility on this border. And both sides developed a whole range of protocols to maintain peace and tranquility on the border. So the breakdown of that peace on this border, I think it's quite a defining moment in the way the two countries are going to relate to each other. The second point is that beyond the military questions, the India-China tensions have been rising on a range of other issues, including on the economic, on the political, on the regional, on the global. So as China rises and India slowly emerges, the friction between the two has been growing in the last many years, certainly in the last decade and more. And we see that this event today, what's happened, and their ability to disentangle it will have a great bearing on their longer term evolutions. So I think we are at the cusp of a profound transformation in the bilateral relationship. The third contextual point I want to mention is the fact that what's happening between India and China, the conflict and the potential deepening of the tensions between them intersects with the larger geopolitical churn that is taking place in the world, in Asia, and certainly the unfolding conflict between China and the United States, which just in the last few days, we've seen so many new things happen on South China Sea, on Hong Kong. So the India-China conflict, I mean, quite clearly intersects with this. And I think much of the Chinese commentary actually talks about the dynamic interaction between what's happening between US and China and what's happening between India and China. And then how this conflict plays out will also have implications for the rest of Asia and the world in terms of how new balances, new security arrangements are going to work themselves out. So whichever way we look at it, I think we are at an interesting and important inflection point in the India-China relationship, and this will have significant consequences for the rest of the region and the world. So what we're going to do is the four panelists, I mean, each of them is going to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we will move after that to see if we can have a round of interactive questions between the panelists, and then head to taking questions from the audience. So please keep sending in your questions in the chat function. My colleagues will kind of collate them, and I will try and thematically integrate them and pass it on to the channel to the speaker. So we have quite a substantive time. Hopefully the speakers will stick to the time. 40 minutes is a good time for a stimulating discussion between the audience, between all of you and the four panelists. So please, when you send in the questions, start doing it quite early on so that we can put them together nicely. So I will stop here my initial remarks, and I'm going to invite Dr. Li Nan from the East Asia Institute to start the panel discussion. Dr. Li Nan, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. I'll talk a little bit about two issues. The first, a little bit background based on a kind of Chinese perspective, my interpretation of Chinese perspective, based on my interaction with analysts in China as well as reading Chinese materials, establish a context. The second issue I'm going to focus on is to evaluate some of the explanations of the crisis. It seems there are so many explanations to the point they're pretty confusing, you know, to try to understand what accounts for this crisis. The first one, a little bit background. As you know, back in '62, China and India fought a border war over two sectors of their long border, the eastern sector and the western sector. The eastern sector is over a chunk of territory the size of Zhejiang province in China, 90,000 square kilometers. In India, it's known as Arunachal Pradesh. In China, it's known as Southern Tibet. The western sector in China is known as Aksai Chin. What's interesting about these two sectors is the eastern sector was controlled by India, has been controlled by India. And China contests the sovereignty of India over that piece of territory. The western sector is the reverse. China controls Aksai Chin, but that was contested by India. It's been contested by India. So the war was over these two sectors. China basically won the war. China established Chinese control over the southern Tibet, the eastern sector as well. The western sector before the war, China controlled it. After the war, China continues to control it. Except both are contested. What's interesting about the Chinese behavior is China decided to withdraw from what it took in the war. The whole chunk of territory known as southern Tibet, and pull back to the line of the traditional line of actual control. So in other words, it returned the control of this whole area back to India after the end of the war. And secondly, what China did is to pull back its troops for another 20 kilometers from this line of control in order to develop a buffer zone between India and China. So China makes two concessions, giving up the territory it conquered in the war, and secondly, pull back from the actual line of control for 20 kilometers. The same with the western sector. The western sector, China still controls the western sector, Aksai Chin, except it pulled back its troops for 20 kilometers from the line of control. So people raise questions about why Chinese troops now move into Galwan Valley, because that was the buffer zone. So Chinese troops, they fought a battle in '62 war over the Galwan Valley. But then after the war, they pulled back. So that Galwan Valley was never occupied by China. It was a buffer zone, except back in April and May, China decided to move the troops into Galwan Valley. The joke among analysts in China is, China won the war, but lost the territory because China gave up the whole chunk of territory back to India. The Arunachal Pradesh, China known as Southern Tibet, which is pretty puzzling to Chinese analysts. There are different explanations, but I'll go beyond that because that takes a lot of time. The Chinese position has been from the 60s, 70s, and 70s, even up to the 80s. China wanted to make a package deal with India. Chinese position is a deal based on exchange of recognition of sovereignty. China recognized India's sovereignty over Arunachal Pradesh or Southern Tibet. India recognizes the Chinese sovereignty over Aksai Chin, the western sector. So make a deal based on mutual recognition of sovereignty. In a sense, Chinese analysts, they believe India has the better deal, simply because the southern Tibet is the southern slope of the Himalayas. It's exposed to the monsoon rains from the Indian Ocean. The soil is very fertile. There are big rivers, there are forests. It's very habitable. It's good for farming and everything. In comparison, the western sector is totally different. It's barren mountains and Gobi Desert, much higher. Very cold in winter, very long winter. Terrains are very difficult even to patrol. And basically, Chinese analysts believe if there is a package deal, India got the better deal. So that's the background. I mean, we want to know a little bit about, from the Chinese perspective. Definitely, India has a different perspective. What happened back in April, May, is that China decided to move its troops up to the line of actual control. So in a sense, it's a more active defense kind of posture, but it's not as much a aggressive, offensive defense kind of posture, simply because from China's perspective, they just moved up to the line of actual control, which used to be a buffer, like a no man's land, because China pulled back for 20 kilometers. So now they decided to move up to the line of actual control. From China's side, from Chinese perspective, there are three very specific drivers. First of all, India built a road, the DBO road, which connects the capital of Ladakh here, right? I mean, up to the northern tip of the territory, which has a military base, an airfield, which is only a few kilometers from the line of actual control. Connected to that road is a secondary road that connects that road to the Galwan Valley, which from the Chinese perspective, that's on the side of the Chinese line of actual control. They fought a battle in '62 over that area. They didn't patrol that area, but they think that's their territory, their piece of territory. Now they decided to move up to that line of control, to control it, to establish control. That's the Chinese perspective. The second driver is India decided to convert this Ladakh into a union territory that extends its jurisdiction to Aksai Chin, which to China is not acceptable because it challenges the Chinese sovereignty over Aksai Chin. But ironically, this is similar to Chinese naming the features in the South China Sea that China doesn't control. So it's pretty ironic, but that's how they think about this issue. Last year, right, in August. The third is the perceived Chinese perception of India building up its military capabilities along the line of actual control, particularly in the Western sector. What's interesting about Chinese perspective is they see Western sector different from the Eastern sector. The Eastern sector, the line of actual control is pretty stable because India is the status quo. It controls the southern Tibet, Arunachal Pradesh. The Western sector is different. China controls Aksai Chin, but it's challenged by India, contested by India. So it has never been stable. So they think to the point, India, from their perspective, India moves closer, sometimes encroach across the line of actual control. They need to be forwardly deployed as well to confront the Indians. So that's the interactive dynamic that drive the spiral. So these are the three direct drivers. Again, I mean, there are different explanations about why there is a crisis, why it happened, back in May and June. The first pretty popular conventional Western explanation is Chinese leader trying to divert attention from domestic discontent, particularly related to COVID-19 and so forth. The second is Chinese leader trying to leverage nationalism. This explanation doesn't make sense simply because on the Chinese side, there's no publicity, there's no propaganda-driven kind of domestic mobilization. For those who are old enough to remember Chinese war against Vietnam, 79, against the Soviet Union on the border, 69, 62 war. You have that propaganda-based mobilization, trying to show the other side being the invader, the aggressor, encroaching on Chinese sovereignty, territories. And the POA, was very defensive. China was the victim. China tries to defend its territory, and the POA was forced to fight a defensive counterattack. Okay, that's the narrative, that Chinese government was trying to present to the domestic. But for this crisis, there's no publicity, there's no propaganda. Nobody knows what happened before, even after the crisis. So that explanation, nationalism, diverting domestic discontent, they don't explain that well. The other explanation, which is pretty popular among some of the China scholars, regional insecurity, drive Chinese leaders to take very tough positions on settling border disputes. For instance, Taylor Fravel from MIT, Yun Sun from STEM Center, they take this argument, except, it's still based on the premise China was the victim. For instance, Yun Sun of Stimson Center basically believes, because India was exploiting Chinese vulnerability stemming from COVID-19 and deterioration of US-China relations. So that provides a window of vulnerability that's being exploited by India by building roads on the borders, converting Ladakh into a Union territory and so forth. So that sort of vulnerability, that sort of exploitation by India is like stabbing a dagger on the back of China. So China needs to retaliate. That's another explanation. China needs to take a very forceful response. The only problem with that explanation, there are three problems. First of all, the DBO road was under construction for 20 years. It didn't happen after the COVID-19. Converting Ladakh to Union territory took place last August, before COVID-19, okay? The third problem with this explanation is, by April and May, China was actually in a very secure, confident position because it got out of COVID-19. In relative comparative terms, India was, in trouble. You had to deal with COVID-19. So the timing didn't match. Actually, you can make the argument not because of Chinese insecurity, but because of Chinese heightened sense of security and confidence. China exploits India's vulnerability in distraction to deal with the domestic crisis like COVID-19 and economic problems and so forth. So China is the reverse of what they try to argue. So that doesn't make sense either. I mean, it makes sense to a certain extent. I mean, it's a theory. I mean, in reality, they have to be tested by empirical evidence. So in other words, you can turn it around and make an opposite argument. So that's the third. That's the second one. The third one is explanation about balance of power, by power competition. China was concerned about the rise of India. China tries to contain India. That makes sense to a certain extent, except there are a few problems. First of all, it seems that sort of policy is too simplistic. If you look at the effects of policy, it didn't produce positive effects for China. Actually, it drives India to the side of the US. And secondly, it didn't take into consideration the economic, benefits for China. Actually, China also loses in terms of economic. China-Indian trade was almost about $90 billion US. I mean, that's a lot of money. So
Dr. Lina, I think you'll have to wrap up. I think if you can wrap up, it'll be nice. Yeah. Can you hear me? I mean, we thought you can just wrap up. We're running over time. So
it's up?
No, I said you're running over time. So if you can wrap up now.
All right. let me finish very, very quickly.
Yeah.
2 minutes.
Thank you.
The second problem with this balance of power explanation is the lack of coordination, interagency coordination. You can tell that the issue was very narrowly defined, focused on military technical issues, particular border defense issues. It didn't really take into consideration about the larger picture, economic loss and gains and so forth. So there is no coordination, it seems it's very narrow. It's a very narrow kind of military focused issue, The final problem with this sort of explanation is if you look at the Chinese force mobilization, they're pretty limited and local, A few companies there, a few companies there. They're reinforced by border defense units that are not heavily armed, WWS did a research to show that there are only 3 companies that have been deployed 500 to 600 people, reinforced up to 1,500 troops. So it's very local. There's no regional or national mobilization. So Chinese posture is really on defense. They were probably reinforced by some tank battalions, tank companies, and towed artillery. But we know towed artillery, they're already, demobilizing most of the units, not from the best units. They're probably being deployed to the border defense units, and border defense units are lightly armed. I guess I'll stop here, So I have my own explanation, but I don't have time. Maybe in Q&A. Yes, please.
No. Thank you, Dr. Lina. And I think it's a very interesting perspective. I think we don't often, get to hear from how the Chinese look at this. So it's really valuable. I think what you said really expands the way we need to think about this subject. So maybe now I will call Yogesh. Yogesh, are you there? Dr. Yogesh Joshi.
Thanks, Prof.
So it's 10 minutes. Huh? So 10 minutes.
Sure. No, I'll be very quick. Yes. Dr. Linan has made my job pretty easy in some sense, but also difficult because I have to keep up to his level of analysis, so to say. But I feel privileged to be a part of this August panel and to share my analysis of the recent Sino-Indian border clashes. I restrict my comments to how New Delhi has perceived the ongoing crisis and what it means for Indian security and foreign policy. I try to address 3 large questions in a sense. What are the underlying causes as India sees it? What are the short-term options for India, both militarily and diplomatically? And lastly, what are the long-term consequences of the crisis on Sino-Indian relations and the balance of power in Indo-Pacific? So first of all, the crisis is fundamentally about overlapping perceptions of the line of actual control. India and China share one of the longest legally undemarcated border in the world, and one of the longest running border disputes. But there have been similar crises before in 2013, 2014, 2017. So what's new? I think there are 4 factors. First of all, there are multiple incursions all along the Sino-Indian border. So it's not only restricted to the western, to the northern part of it, but when we saw that in May, things also happened in Nathula and Sikkim, and there was mobilization even in the eastern region. Second, this is the biggest mobilization in decades. You kind of see both sides have more than 200,000 troops, lined across the border. Most importantly, the simmering tensions for decades, the tensions which have been simmering for decades have finally boiled over. As Prof mentioned, this is the first time in 45 years that you have battle casualties, which is as many in India, basically calling it to be an inflection point. And lastly, the established patterns of military and diplomatic engagement have broken down, and there is a sense of deep distrust which prevails on both sides. Now, coming to the causes, I think the causes have to be thought over at the tactical, at the operational, and at the strategic level. And I think Dr. Lina touched upon it. But in some sense, at the technical level, this was military opportunism on the part of the PLA, basically diverting troops from a summer exercise in Tibet onto the border, and basically salami slicing some of the some of the territory, which they obviously claim on their part of the LAC, but has been patrolled on both sides. Again, because of the overlapping perceptions of the LAC. But the established pattern was that there would be no total control of these territories, and I think that's the understanding which has been breached. But the faux pas has also been on the part of the Indians, because there was intelligence coming in to the Indian Army, and they couldn't really process it. The COVID-19 crisis didn't allow Indian Army to mobilize, at the right time for their spring exercises. So I think at the tactical level, it was just the level of about the timing as such. At the operational level, I think there are three major factors. One is definitely, as Dr. Linan mentioned, the development of the border infrastructure, which China has actually done for quite some time, and India has been catching up in last decade. The actions of the PLA are partly motivated by the need to achieve tactical control of key areas on the LAC before they enter a situation of military deadlock. The second point is about the change in the constitutional status of Jammu and Kashmir, and what Beijing perceives as an intention of revisionism on the Indian side. And the Chinese actions have been in the past over assimilation of some of the border regions, whether it was Sikkim in 1960s or Arunachal in 1980s, elicited similar response. But as far as the issue of Aksai Chin is concerned, I think there has been a status quoist approach from India, and as in 2005 there was an understanding that there would be mutual boundary swap. So I think the Indians didn't really communicate it to the level they should have, but the Indian approach has always been status quoist. And Foreign Minister Jaishankar actually traveled to Beijing in August. I think the fundamental problem for the Indian side is that New Delhi should have foreseen and prepared adequately for any military surprise posed by the PLA after the change in constitutional status of Jammu and Kashmir. There has been a complacency which resulted actually from the success of India's deterrent strategy with southern China, particularly after Doklam. Over the years, a perception has developed in the Indian mind that even when Chinese would make a lot of noise, when faced with determined opposition, they will settle rather than pursue hostilities. Indian diplomacy also reposed a lot of faith and confidence in the sanctity of the border agreement and the confidence-building measures. The crisis, therefore, is a result of the overconfidence of India's diplomatic and military success in the recent past. And lastly, at the strategic level, the crisis is a manifestation of the fundamental change in the balance of power between India and China, whether in military or economic terms. The period of peaceful rise of China in some sense is now over, and there is, in some sense, an expansionist streak and also assertiveness in Chinese leadership. So, the fact that the crisis overlaps with increasing belligerence on Taiwan, Hong Kong, South China Sea is not merely a coincidence. The second factor is a belief that India is already part of the anti-China coalition of liberal democracies, and therefore there is no point, it has reached a point of no return, and therefore there is no incentive to kind of, not to put greater pressure on its Himalayan neighbor. Lastly, from the Indian point of view, the fundamental clash of national interests with China, territorial as well as over status, has now come out in the open, and no amount of diplomatic sugarcoating would alleviate the existential issues facing the Sino-Indian relationship. If China aims for Asian hegemony, in my view, New Delhi cannot simply acquiesce. What are India's short-term military and diplomatic options? In fact, the disengagement process and the de-escalation process is still going on. So there is not completely a breakdown of those patterns of de-escalation and disengagement which they have agreed upon. But there are two military scenarios which have been contemplated both at the level of strategic analysts, but also in the government, so to say. One is that India should resort to similar salami slicing on the Chinese side of the LAC. Given that mere defense of all disputed sectors is impossible at all times, Indian Army should carry out its own tit-for-tat operations along the Chinese side of the LAC. This punishment strategy may allow India to barter and negotiate better in post-crisis environment. Second is this strategy of deterrence by punishment should also extend to Indian Ocean. The Indian Navy should punish the Chinese Navy and merchant shipping, the lifeline of the Chinese economy in the Indian Ocean, to influence its behavior along the land frontier. However, both these scenarios suffered from certain disadvantages. First, a tit-for-tat strategy requires both surprise and resolve. Under the current scenario, with heavy mobilization on both sides, surprise would come at a premium. And if war is a negotiation of power and resolve, India's punishment strategy would require a high level of political resolve because of the inherent dangers of escalation in pursuing the salami slicing tactics. At this moment, however, given the domestic economy and the pandemic situation, resolve is hard to come by. The naval strategy, on the other hand, does not work for short crisis or limited war scenarios. First, the naval operations take a long period of time before manifesting their intended impact on the behavior of the adversary. And second, an anti-sloth strategy would fail without a concerted effort along the whole of the Indo-Pacific. Rather than military options, therefore, most likely for India, a signaling of resolve through would be communicated through diplomatically and through weaponizing economic interdependence, which would be covered by Dr. Palit later. This would entail further strengthening of the Quad, inclusion of Australia into Malabar exercises, greater level of intelligence coordination, including India's joining of Five Eyes network, and some activism over issues most sensitive to Beijing, such as Taiwan and Hong Kong. We have already seen some major developments in some of these areas. Second, we can be fairly certain that high-level diplomatic contact between the political leadership of the two countries would now go into a deep freeze. We will have no Wuhan-type symmetry. Coming lastly to the long-term consequences, I see two long-term consequences. First is deep mistrust and intensifying of the Sino-Indian security dilemma. The crisis has undermined the very basis of Sino-Indian understanding on resolving the border dispute. As former Indian ambassador to China, Gautam Bambawale has warned, the border management architecture now belongs to the heap of history. Partly this engendered out of a belief that India can actually achieve a separate peace with China, as was evident in numerous diplomatic initiatives after the 1962 war, whether in 1969, in 1973, in 1980, or in 1988. Those hopes have now been completely dashed. India's diplomatic and military closeness with the US and other Indo-Pacific powers will only exacerbate already intense Sino-Indian security dilemma. The second part, which India has been trying to do but hasn't actually gone all the way, is internal balancing with external alignments. Even when no one is going to fight India's wars, India must acknowledge that others can help it to fight them better. The whole debate on strategic autonomy cannot hijack vital Indian national interests, and New Delhi should develop synergies, economic, diplomatic, military, to stand up to Chinese pressure and create deterrence. That would require undertaking risk concomitant with all strategic alignments, both of entrapment and abandonment. But those are the risks that India would have to run. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Yogesh, for looking at the Indian perspective. So I think you touched on all the key motivations, the operational considerations, as well as the long-term diplomatic and political choices. Now I'll call on Ryan Connor to speak on the, can respond and also say his own piece in terms of the larger international dimension that this conflict has. Ryan, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you, sir. Perfect. So I'll just layer on to what Dr. Lee and what Dr. Joshi have already contributed. And I would just like to say thanks to everyone who's on the call with us this afternoon. I know everyone's quite busy, especially in the post-GE period. So thanks for taking the time to spend with us this afternoon. So what I'd like to do, if it's okay, I'd like to keep my points pretty brief and pretty crisp and open up some time for Q&A, because I think the interaction with people's questions, I'm seeing some of the questions already, they're quite interesting. So I prefer to minimize the one-directional speaking. So I think my views on this are pretty simple. I mean, 2020, at the risk of stating the obvious, has been a unique year. I think if we take the South China Sea as a case in point, it's just a simple statistical matter. We've seen a very sharp uptick in Chinese naval activity and also American and allied naval activity in the South China Sea. And this is something which I don't think should be considered. People should be too surprised about. I mean, these were trends that whether we're looking at artificial island creation and a whole range of other strategic challenges in that particular theater. These trends were already occurring, but they were rapidly accelerated for a range of reasons. And I don't think we should sprinkle sugar on the fact that the COVID-19 outbreak and some of the impacts that it's had on the region, you can't separate these two out from each other. They are interrelated. So I think we've seen that sharp uptick in activities. So I think if you put that in the context of the Sino-Indian border issue, and I mean, as you guys may have gathered, I always joke, I'm neither Indian or Chinese, but you know, we look at the border, the Sino-Indian border. It's obviously massive. It's, as others have noted, it's not properly demarcated in any way. And if you look at I don't want to overanalyze the Galwan Valley incidents. Of course, it's extremely serious, but others have looked at this in a great level of detail. For me, what's very, very telling about that situation was that this occurred during an official de-escalation period and that the soldiers were unarmed. So there's a couple of questions. I think when we're looking at the border, it's everything from how does command and control work on the border, and to be frank, on the PLA side, and also, you know, in terms of the Galwan Valley, that's where that particular incident happened to occur. But if you look at how long this border is, and if you look at, you know, an overall strategic layer of that border and how consequential it is for both parties, you can make an assessment, I think reasonably, that you have the potential for random outbreaks of violence all across the border, whether we're talking about the western region, Ladakh, whether we're talking about Arunachal Pradesh, whatever region we happen to be talking about, the potential is there because you have a lot of accelerant or a lot of tension brewing in the background for a whole range of reasons. And I think that's something to keep in mind. And there's a lot of talk, you're seeing a lot of assessments and forecasts around, you know, if India does this, China will do this, et cetera, et cetera. To be frank, a lot of this is very, very speculative. It's very easy to take one particular action, but then to anticipate accurately the primary, secondary, tertiary impacts of those actions, that's an entirely different thing. I guarantee you, the Indian troops that were walking up to that tent to handle the de-escalation talks did not anticipate what was going to happen. I think that's what makes this so challenging and so critical, that we are balanced and we don't get too high, we don't get too low. I think the other angle on this that I think is important to note is that a lot of analysts and a lot of people discussing this look at this as they almost compartmentalize the issue, but there's not, you know, and there's PLA doctrine behind this, talking about high-tech war under localized conditions, and that sounds very nice, but once that hits reality or has contact with reality, it's just doctrine in a journal article. India has one of the largest, most sophisticated, and most capable navies in the world. And I think, as Dr. Joshi had mentioned, that's not just going to sit in port. And so I think the challenge that we're going to have to manage going forward is when we talk about escalation control, it's not just on the land-based border. There's a lot of other angles to this. There's an immediate maritime angle. And so I think that's something to bear in mind. And then I think I'd like to wrap up with just, if I may, on the U.S. response so far. I think it's been quite balanced. I think it's been actually pretty optimal. And so I think people don't quite understand this. There's a lot of misperceptions, but the reality is, despite a lot of the talk in the media, President Trump's foreign policy, as it relates to military action, his preferences are very clear. He prefers intelligence, cooperation, very precise, targeted operations. He is not a traditional put thousands of troops on the ground type of leader. Now, the situation in the South China Sea, I know we have some U.S. naval personnel on the call, so they'll be able to talk about this in greater depth than I do. But the U.S. has put multiple aircraft carrier strike groups deployed into the South China Sea for a range of reasons. A lot of it being driven by the need to assure treaty allies. But the response to the situation in the U.S.'s strategic communications and engagement with India has been quite interesting. I think basically my interpretation of the response has been the U.S. has basically opened up an entire menu of options for everything from satellite imagery to intelligence support, a whole range of other hardware platforms, and basically said, more or less, these options are available. We'll follow your lead, Prime Minister Modi, in terms of what you think is most appropriate and what is in India's interest. And I think I believe that's the right way to go about it. Future prediction is I'm not smart enough to predict the future, but I'll hazard a couple of near-term forecasts. I do think that India's traditional reliance on Russian defense systems or weapon systems, I think that is going to steadily trend this way for a whole range of reasons. And so I think whether it was intentionally or unintentionally, I think this border dispute between India and China, I do think that is going to accelerate another pre-existing trend of pushing the US and India closer together in strategic and military affairs. This was already happening, but it was occurring more kind of at this pace. And now I think we're seeing it more like this. What the implications of that are is something that we have to monitor quite closely. There's many variables, there's a lot of moving parts, but I think the key thing is to, this is the type of situation that big theoretical constructs, it's not going to do much for you. You have to monitor it day by day and stay very fact-based. And I think with that, if it's okay, I'd like to wrap my monologue up and take questions.
Thank you, Ryan. I think both the US reaction has been quite interesting, and the Russian angle, of course, remains, and how this plays out, because Russia and China today are much closer than before, and Russia is also continues to be close to India. So I think that's a very interesting dynamic. I'm sure there'll be some questions on that as we look ahead. Now, let me invite the last speaker, Dr. Amitendu Palit.
Thank you so much, Professor Mohan. It's been a pleasure listening to my previous speakers and enriching myself from their perspectives. Let me begin by being a little provocative. I'll make a statement on what I think about the India-China economic relationship. And then I'll go on to substantiate as to why I think what I'm saying is going to hold out. I believe that the India-China economic relationship is going to widen and going to get bigger. But I also believe that there are parts and characters of this relationship which is going to change from what we have right now. It's going to change substantively. Some of these changes might not be even visible. But nonetheless, in sum total, we are going to see a much bigger relationship, notwithstanding the conflict, or maybe even partly because of the conflict. Let me pick up three elements of the economic relationship. Let's look at trade. There's been this huge anxiety over actions being taken on trade. The point is, India has not taken a single action on trade so far. There's no action taken by India on trade so far. What has happened in India is a call for boycott China-made products, which is a call which has not sprung up overnight, but which has been in existence for quite a few years. It culminated into a crescendo before the final round of RCEP negotiations, which India backed out of. Today, it has taken a deeper hue in some respect. But having said that, till now, India has not taken a single unilateral tariff action on any Chinese imports into the country. As of now, it might do so in future. But even if India does, the room for such action, initiating or inflicting any economic damage on China is very limited. Chinese exports, and China is the world's largest exporter, are roughly $2.5 trillion. Out of those, $70 billion exports come to India. India is not China's largest export market by any stretch of imagination. Out of this $70 billion which India is importing from China, India's room for maneuver is only with respect to $10 or $12 billion of imports, which are basically low value added, quickly substitutable imports. The remaining are all primarily essential imports, capital goods, or even consumer goods, which are primarily being imported by the Indian domestic industry for fundamental use in a large variety of areas, beginning from coal, fertilizer, active pharmaceutical ingredients for the Indian generic industry, electrical machinery, so on and so forth. We can discuss those in later. India is perfectly aware of this possibility, as a result of which it has been trying to develop a program of building domestic capacities as much as possible so as to ensure a reduction of dependence on Chinese imports and imports at large. This is what has culminated into the Atmanirbhar Bharat or self-reliance India, but those reliances and capacities are going to take time to develop. maybe 5, 6, 7 years, and that will require more fundamental transformation of the Indian economy. So let's leave aside trade. This relationship is going to continue for the foreseeable future. That takes us into two other spheres of economic relationship. Investments. There's been a lot of talk about investments from China being regulated into India. Now, I want to make a point over here. I think if we look at China in the list of investors as far as India's incoming foreign direct investment concerned, it's at a measly number 18. Chinese FDI into India is nothing compared with the FDI that is coming in from Mauritius, Singapore, Germany, UK, even the Cayman Islands. It's not visible. The only space where Chinese FDI in India is visible is in the digital tech startup space, where there are around $4 billion plus Chinese investments, which are funding roughly 20% of Indian unicorns with a market capitalization of more than $1 billion. And the point to be noted here is why. The point is very simple. Globally, Indian startups rarely have access to any other source of venture capital and supporting capital. Because let's not forget the fact that startups take a lot of time to mature. They bleed for several years. So one needs investors who are prepared to take that bleeding. And that bleeding, the best example is the Alibaba investment in Paytm, which is to the tune of 40%. Now, such investments will be welcomed by Indian startups till the time they actually can look at alternative funds. And let me also caution you here, alternative funds are going to be very difficult to locate because for the last 4 years, China has actually transformed itself to an exporter of capital rather than being an importer of capital. Today, it is among the world's largest exporter of capital in terms of outward foreign direct investment. And the biggest mistake that we make is that when we look at Chinese FDI, we exclude Hong Kong. Now, Chinese FDI into India is going to come in, but it's going to park itself through a variety of channels and routes, which are not going to be clearly visible because there are a number of investment locations and channels through which these investments are going to flow into various directions. And remember, India is a very different market for Chinese investment because unlike Chinese investment in the rest of the world, where it is mostly locating in physical infrastructure, in India, it is not the case. One of the reasons for that is that India backed out of the land and maritime-based Belt and Road Initiative, but knowingly or unwillingly, India has become a part of the Digital Belt and Road Initiative through the space that Chinese capital has come to capture in India's digital and startup space. Now, India's reaction in that respect was a fairly well thought out reaction, cut out the space for China and its investors to support digital content in India's startup space. So banning of nearly 60 Chinese apps. But the problem is that at some stage, the Indian startups are going to turn around and say that, look, where am I going to access the funds? They might be accessing the international markets through Cayman Islands, through Hong Kong. And those are clearly the areas. The problem is money or investment does not have an origin. Unlike goods, goods can be labeled made in China or made in Hong Kong. Money does not have that origin. So it's actually futile to take steps to ban Chinese investment directly, because firstly, that's going to invite a response from the WTO immediately. Secondly, any other creative ways of blocking that route out has to be really, really supremely creative, because otherwise the startup space is going to be completely devoid and starved of funds. And let me now turn to a third element of the India-China economic relationship. Many probably are not aware of the fact that India is the fourth largest insofar as overseas students studying in China is concerned. Right after Thailand, Korea, and Pakistan. 23,000 Indian students are studying in China today, out of which more than 90% are studying medical education. There are serious quality issues with respect to the degrees obtained from China and then passing a screening exam at home and then getting to practice in India. But the problem is, why are these students going to China? A, public colleges in India have very limited space. B, private medical colleges in India are exorbitantly expensive. So the buck stops with India. Till the time such capacities are created for affordable technical education, there is every possibility that Indian students will try to figure out spaces for traveling abroad. Let's look at tourism. Till the end of last year, there was a specific plan for India to capture a much greater share of the 50 million Chinese tourists who travel out each year, out of which only 3.5 million come to India, and they are among the largest spenders, because Chinese tourists have developed a reputation of being the highest spending community in the world. The point is that there are direct actions and indirect actions. There are direct actions where India might try to take some steps. Exports is one area. There might be limited actions coming up. You might get to see some substitution.
Amitendra, you need to wrap up.
The shape of trade will get restricted, but there are other spaces where the economic activity is going to flourish, may not be in a fully visible form, but nonetheless, the integration has been so organic and it is getting settled into so many diverse spaces that this is unlikely to be wished away. Thank you, Raja.
Thank you, Amitendra. Thank you for reminding us how hard it is to decouple from China on the economic front. Notwithstanding the crisis, I don't know, the US-China thing will happen. China remains the second largest economy in the world, and its power, it's and 30 years of expanded economic engagement, including in the digital one. But I think when politics takes over, it has a rationality that is different from the logic of immediate commercial and economic reasoning. So there is a tension, I think, there between deep economic interdependence and the political divergence. How that plays out is going to be quite interesting. But I just can't resist saying about Indian students, they'll go anywhere for medical colleges. So that is very much part of the Indian tradition. They used to go to Russia in the past. All over Central Asia, there's still any medical college anywhere. We'll do MBBS anywhere. I'm ready to travel. So, but that is a structure, I think, but one hopes there'll be more Chinese students in India as well. So, but let's see how that educational exchange goes on. But let me stop and maybe start just one round of questions from me, and then we'll go to the audience. We've got a good 30 odd minutes. So first to Dr. Leenan and Yogesh Joshi, I mean, that how do you see the de-escalation process? I mean, because obviously this is linked to the nature of the political will. I mean, I think Dr. Leenan did a great job, questioning a lot of the traditional assumptions or conventional assumptions that have been defined in relation to the origins of the crisis. But I wonder if we can speculate a bit on how this might get sorted out. We've seen some de-escalation in most sectors, but in the Pangong Tso sector, where everyone says it's going to be hard. So do you have some idea in terms of the Chinese motivations for de-escalation, and how far will they go, or will they hang in some places? So this idea of salami slicing that Yogesh talked about. So I think, how do you see the de-escalation, disengagement? Will China be prepared to go to a full restoration of the status quo ante? Is that possible? So that's my question to maybe Yogesh. On the flip side, can India really, can it hold on, I mean, for the full restoration of the status quo ante? And if China does not restore the full status quo ante, what does it do? So I think, so since the current focus is on disengagement and de-escalation, maybe we could have some perspectives from you both. Dr. Leenan, you want to start first? And you can start by unmuting. Yes.
De-escalation, there are a few mitigating factors. For instance, both sides, they don't resort to guns. They use their fists to fight each other. That helps to de-escalate. Except, the fist goes beyond the sort of limit to the point people get killed. But other than that, I mean, confidence building measures, to the point they can develop a buffer zone, a real genuine buffer zone, based on the consensus of the bilateral consensus, not the unilateral Chinese, sort of definition of the line of actual control. It has to be bilateral. Confidence building measures, that helps. Natural conditions makes it difficult. Long winter, by winter, these crises will be gone. Difficult terrains, that helps. High altitude, that makes it very difficult to breathe. So in other words, it makes it very difficult to patrol the area, to build permanent camps, bunkers in the whole area. I think that helps. Nuclear deterrence, mutual deterrence, that helps too. That helps to de-escalate. I mean, it doesn't have to go beyond, sort of conventional, sort of face-based sort of strifes. It doesn't even have to go beyond the gunshots. What else? Diplomacy, summit, and so forth. But generally speaking, I think, if you analyze the Chinese position, it's based on defense. It's not, it's the secondary strategic direction, 次要战略方向. Its primary strategic direction is maritime, maritime. Other priorities, domestic concerns, domestic problems, domestic challenges, COVID-19, economic recovery, finding jobs for everybody. Those are the priorities. It's not about China vis-a-vis India. It's not the top priority. Look at the kind of troops they deploy. They're light armed defense border units, companies, battalions, at most regiments. They're not heavily armed. They don't have tanks. They don't have, tracked or wheeled artilleries. They only have towed artilleries. Towed artilleries are backward. Reaction is very slow. It doesn't deploy that well. It's not well protected. Better units, they don't use towed artilleries anymore in China. So my point is, they all look at, the IIS analysis. One company in Pangong Lake, north bank of the Pangong Lake. One patrol boat squadron on the lake. One company close to this, at this Conga Pass, which is close to hot springs. And then a few companies in Galwan Valley. Those troops that were deployed there, they were shipped by trucks. They are not heavily armed. You don't see tank battalions, and so forth, except in the back, far back, behind the hot springs. There are a couple of photos that shows, satellite photos that shows, there are a couple of tank companies. But again, they're just tank companies, 12 tanks. There's no massive force built up. So it's for defense. It's pretty clear. I mean, it's not the primary strategic direction. If you're on the defense, the cost is cheaper, right? I mean, you can exploit the terrains, build the bunkers, and so forth. You don't need, you are better protected, you are less exposed to the threats of your opposition. If you want to attack, it's a different story. It's very costly. You have to build up forces many times to the side you want to attack. But that was not the case. Only a few battalions being forwardly deployed, backed up by some other sort of border defense, up to 1,000, 1,500 troops. That's what IIS count, So in that sense, it's purely defense. There is no evidence to show China wants to fight a war against India. So in that sense, I think the buffer is good. Work on the buffer, to agree on a buffer, to the point eventually, it's difficult to work out a final solution, but eventually they probably want to work out a package deal. I think the package deal is good. India got a better deal. China could recognize sovereignty over the southern Tibet. I mean, India's sovereignty. I mean, so what in exchange for India recognition of Chinese sovereignty over Aksai Chin? The southern Tibet is much larger, much fertile. It's a valuable piece of property compared to Aksai Chin. I mean, there's nothing that grows there. Yeah, that's my point. Thank you.
Yogesh, you want to come in just quickly? Yeah. You're muted.
So I think I would agree with Dr. Lina that China doesn't want the war, but it wants its political objectives to be completed without a war. That's the whole strategy. So even with de-escalation and de-engagement, if they are able to shift the LAC, that's what they want. And for India, then either war is a negotiation between power and resolve. So you have to show your resolve and escalate, and that's the dilemma India is in. So so India is hard pressed in that sense. As far as the issue about LAC and maintaining the level of force troops, and this is very interesting that the level of multiple incursions and the level of troop movement, and given the infrastructure on the Chinese side, the LAC may become as hot as the LOC with the Pakistan border, and that's the problem for India. So India's strategy had always been defense in depth, but given the diplomatic achievements in Sino-Indian relations and border peace and tranquility on the Sino-Indian border, India could actually focus much more on Pakistan rather than on China. Now, this would stretch your military capability like anything. And that's the danger. That's the danger which India has to face and actually, create those internal capabilities if it is forced upon us at some point in time. But also agree to the fact both of these states are post-colonial in some sense, and territory is vital for their national identity, for their, it's an existential issue, and nobody's going to give that up. So you're actually going to look at a further intensification, even when both sides would claim to be defensive, and that's the problem with sectarian dilemmas. You claim to be defensive, but ultimately it results into much more intense, hostilities.
Thank you. I want to ask Ryan. And you want to push a little bit on the geopolitics of it. Externally, its intersection with the other major powers, and do you see the relationship to what's happening on other fronts? In South China Sea, in the region, that, of course, all of us as analysts, we want to put 2 and 2, make it 22. But when things happen simultaneously, we all tend to see them all as a single picture. But so do you see there's a larger dimension to this in Asia of what's happening between India and China?
I think my interpretation of what's going on, and you're exactly right. Sometimes we can, if you're not very careful, you can make sloppy connections that may or may not be there. I think the Chinese Communist Party basically views the situation as our time has come. It was coming anyways, but the COVID-19 outbreak, and as the story goes, our superior response relative to the rest of the Asia Pacific, especially our rivals in it, has accelerated our time. We're here, and this is what a great power does. A great power in the South China Sea, a great power controls their own first and second island chain. That means the U.S. has to acquiesce to this. We're the guy that runs the neighborhood. And so I think you see that general view manifesting itself on the border with India as well. So you may see a situation where the situation in the South China Sea de-escalates while it could potentially escalate on the Sino-Indian border. I don't think that they go up and down together at all. And I think so what we're seeing various manifestations of that general strategic assessment within the current leadership of the CCP that China is going. I don't think China has ambitions at this point in time, real serious ambitions beyond Asia. But I do think they view themselves as the leader of, I don't want to say hegemon because that's kind of a bit of a poorly defined term, but they definitely view any major initiative, any major activities that happen in Asia should run through Beijing first. And I think if you have that mindset and you have that that assessment of your own immediate neighborhood, then yes, these are the Sino-Indian border. China refers to Arunachal Pradesh as South Tibet. It's not just for publicity. That's their actual claim. So I think, I don't mean to sound too negative about it, but I think this is something that is going to smolder for an extended period of time, because I don't think that the CCP leadership is going to modify their assessment of their immediate regional environment. I think they view that now is the time to to push ahead, because they may not have a window like this again.
Thank you. I just want to ask Amitendu just whether you can give the flip side of what he was arguing, which is assuming there is no return to status quo ante, and given the interdependence that you pointed to, deep economic interdependence, certainly India's dependence on China. Are there any steps that India can take on the economic front, which, because partly they have to be seen as doing something. You could say, look, some of it is merely for posturing for domestic audiences, you're doing something. But more fundamentally, is there any steps that India can take on the economic front to signal to China that, look, we will do things, and we're not going to just take everything just lying down. So.
Raja, thank you for asking me that. Let me come to this from the point that you mentioned with respect to Indian students. You are absolutely right. They travel all over the world for seeking professional qualifications, particularly the medicine studying people, largely because there are not sufficient capacity.
Increase your volume a bit.
Yeah, largely because, for Indian medical aspirants, there are not sufficient affordable capacities at home, in a very similar way in which Indian workers across skills have been traveling all over the world for finding jobs. Now, this is what brings me to the larger question of a self-reliant India and what it might mean for China in terms of an economic reaction. I think self-reliant India from a common sense perspective has to be entirely about building indigenous capacities. My question is, how does that capacity get built? Who funds it? This is where I'm seriously skeptical about the ability of the Indian state to actually fund the kind of scale and ambition that it requires to do for building up these indigenous capacities, walk back from China, create affordable options, and then come back to China on a level playing field. You mentioned about what India can do in terms of a retaliatory action, trying to send a signal to China. I think we just pick up a lesson from what the Chinese did. The Chinese utilized investments from the US and Japan to build up incredible capacities domestically today. So much so they are not really particularly worried about the switches and the supply chains and those resilient and so on and so forth. I think the time for India today is to actually not take on China, but use China for taking on China.
No, let me tell you, I'm asking, I'm not saying what India can't do. I'm saying, look, because politics, there is a demand, right? You have to be seen as doing something. So if you say, look, if you're asked, tell me 3 steps India can take to inflict some economic. So are there any steps, or are you saying there is none at all? Because the building up India's, national economic, all that is for the longer term. So I'm talking about the near term. Are there anything on the economic commercial field India can take to signal its displeasure or to signal that, look, it is not going to be satisfied with
for satisfying the domestic constituency, yes. Number one is to give a very clear and upfront statement that we are never going to go back to
not statements. I'm asking actions. Is there any? So are you saying there are no actions at all that India can take?
I don't think there are any substantive actions. They can only be politically symbolic steps, like announcing a list of, let's say, 150 imports which are planned to be restricted from China, or putting out a white paper on how to regulate Chinese investments in various sectors of the economy. I don't think there are any substantive economic steps which India can take.
Okay, so that's helpful. Yeah. So okay, now maybe we have a number of questions from the audience, because I'm going to answer one of them from Ambassador Sajjad Ashraf, who used to be Pakistan's High Commissioner to Singapore, about Modi's statement that nobody's entered our territory. So I think, look, that is part of Indian politics. These days in the television age, social media, you take out one soundbite. So the problem is really not about whether he said is true or did he mean what he said. Was it part of a larger statement? But the important thing I think you're pointing to is, look, what is territory here? The problem certainly in the Western sector, that you don't agree on where one's territory ends or one's other territory begins. Because India claims the entire Aksai. Of course, the whole thing is India's, from the Indian perspective. So the argument today is really about your side of line of actual control or my side of line of actual control? And then there is a dispute on where exactly is the line of actual control. So I think, so use of the word territory in this juncture is actually quite misleading. So I think the lot of confusion is generated by these terms. The fact is, as Dr. Linan said, look, China is sitting on a large part of that Sachin. I mean, that's the old story. Now the question is, can you stabilize that line of actual control, or firstly define what it is? There, I think our Chinese friends, I mean, at this point, they're not interested in engaging on that issue, line of actual, clarifying the line of actual control. But that in turn actually means settling the boundary dispute, and the boundary dispute, resolving the boundary dispute, those negotiations have stalled for quite some time. And I think probably the politics is going to make it harder in the days ahead. So that is, but there are other questions. One, for example, if any one of you want to take up, how are India's smaller neighbors going to react to this? I mean, as India-China conflict enters a more visible, because until now, at least, there was a sense of India-China for all their problems. They were managing it well. They were sitting in RIC and BRICS and multipolar world, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So at least there was a scaffolding of cooperation between the two. So does the conflict, what does it do to the policies of the India's smaller neighbors, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Maldives? Do they get more options to play the game in between these two powers, or it's actually going to constrict the space? Because if India, China are at loggerheads, it might also constrict in some cases. Does anybody want to take this question? I mean, Ryan, you have any thoughts on this?
Just a few humble ones. I think, in terms of, what direction a place like Nepal or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Pakistan is going to take, these are massive questions. I think the one case in point is the Hambantota deep sea port in Sri Lanka, and what happened and how that progressed when the Sri Lankan government was unable to service the loans from China. And I think that, that is something that the speed in which there was a phase transition in terms of who managed that port and how, I think that was a very illustrative example for other smaller South Asian countries. We call them smaller countries. Bangladesh is not small necessarily, but I think that highlighted to some of India's other neighbors. For example, Pakistan is a bit of a different case, but I think that highlighted to Bangladesh and Nepal, for example, and Sri Lanka itself, that China is not, China is a country like any other. It looks after its own national interests, and when you're taking loans from state-owned banks, and you're engaging with state-owned companies, that they're going to operate and function accordingly. So I don't think that the situation has escalated to a point where India's South Asian neighbors are going to be forced to take, or feel enough pressure that they're going to be forced to take sides. I think Pakistan has a structural reality which is quite different from the others, but I think we're not anywhere near that point yet. But I would say, if it does escalate to that stage where you actually have these very stark decisions that need to be made, I think that, depending on the nature of the government, whoever happens to be in control in Bangladesh, and that can change back and forth fairly quickly. We all know this. I think there's much more realism in terms of how far you can go down the pathway with China. I think there's a broad recognition that South Bangladesh, for example, and Nepal have obtained enormous benefits from China in terms of infrastructure, other types of inputs, no question. But I think my assessment on this is that the maximum utility of that strategy from the Chinese side has probably been achieved. And I think the nature in which Hambantota changed hands, I think, was quite eye-opening. So I don't think we're anywhere near that point. I do think that the approach has been to try to maximize benefits from interactions with China. But I think if push really came to shove, it's very difficult to see a situation emerging where you would have an unequivocally pro-China Sri Lanka or Bangladesh. It's very difficult to see how that would happen. So that would be my 2 cents. But I put that forward humbly because a lot of this is a little bit speculative. We're talking about a future that may or may not unfold.
Okay. There were, a number of questions. Yeah, Dr. Lina, you want to come in on this? Unmute. Yeah. Dr. Linan, you want to unmute and you want to come in?
Sure. Because, I did a lot of research on China's policy and strategies as early as Deng Xiaoping and so forth. Personally, I don't think it's sure. I mean, you definitely have that sort of popularity contest between, you can develop a narrative about India, China having a popularity contest, among the minor players. Except, it's geopolitics to a certain extent. You got to build up yourself to the point you can play these, great power games. I think, personally, I think India should learn from Deng Xiaoping, what Deng Xiaoping was trying to do is, first of all, to create a peaceful external environment, which is conducive to economic growth. So in that sense, India has good relations with Russia, with the US, which is good. It could, settle the border disputes with China as what China did with Russia. So that really creates a peaceful external environment for economic development. Secondly, looking at the maritime direction, comparatively speaking, Chinese strategists, they envy the strategic position of India. Because India didn't have to deal with the issue of Taiwan, didn't have to deal with the US-Japan security alliance. It didn't have to deal with, strategic sea lanes, choke points like Malacca Strait. Because it can buy oil next door. It doesn't have to ship its oil all the way through the Malacca Strait back to where, its destination. So it's in a real better, much better position. So what India wants to do is to focus on the economy, build up its economy to the point it can play these big, great power games. I think that's the way, that's the right way to do, for India. That's my take on this.
What countries ought to do and what they do, it's never the same thing. So while the logic, all of us, but the politics where it comes in, territorial nationalism, as one of you pointed out, friction is part of life. And I think today, if you're talking about geopolitics in the middle of pandemic, when actually the world should be coming together, working with each other, are we seeing the kind of the tensions that are beginning to unfold? In some ways, crisis actually reinforce the divisions. And I think we are in that danger, I think, but that's for another day. We will talk about it. But there were a lot of questions. I think how does the talking about India's options, for example, people talk rather, casually, I think, about playing the Tibet card, or then there is the talk about India doing more things with Taiwan. There is the question of a role of Tibetan community in India, so Dalai Lama. So you have a whole lot of issues like that, or India doing more on the maritime. That I think Yogesh addressed that issue. So these set of issues, that these are quite clearly, all of them are very provocative to China. So are there really kind of posturing, or can it really be possible to do something on the so-called cards that India has? So any one of you want to respond on that? Yogesh, you want to start?
Yeah.
Briefly, and now we're beginning to run into time here.
No, I definitely think that, so the problem is this. The problem is that at least the Indian perception is that India has given a lot. It hasn't received that much. So if China is sensitive on Tibet and Taiwan, India is sensitive on Kashmir. What have we got, basically? So I think the era of compromises in that sense is over. And if one looks at India's historical perceptions of China, it's about creating an international environment which doesn't support opportunity. The 1962 war actually happened in the light of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Mao would not have entered, the Indian territory if that would not have been the case. So what I'm trying to say is to create deterrent, both diplomatically as well as militarily. And I think the Indians always perceive Chinese to be extremely rational compared to Pakistan. So there is an idea of rationality which Indians kind of think Chinese have, and that rationality has to be communicated in terms of deterrence, both diplomatically as well as militarily.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to come in on this? In fact, Ryan, you want to come in on the?
Just a quick one. So I think it's a great question. It's a great question. I think, in terms of take a piece by piece. So Taiwan, India's offered diplomatic support and other types of political support to Taiwan's status, which is fine. Yet that's to be expected. The situation across the Taiwan Straits is serious, but it's relatively stable in that there's a relatively fixed structural reality, maintaining a military balance, escalation, de-escalation, pre-event, in-event, post-event. All that is, I don't want to trivialize it. It requires consistent maintenance and some very sharp thinking, but it's relatively well parameterized for the most part. The situation in Tibet is a bit of a different story. I mean, Dr. Lee has very eloquently laid out the challenges of terrain and seasonality, et cetera. But I think, one of the things that people, I don't want to overemphasize this, but one of the dynamics that sometimes doesn't get emphasized enough is the water issue. I mean, they do call Tibet, Asia's water tower for a reason. And I think, the reality is at this point in time, China, the great South-North water diversion project, which has resulted in, the provision of clean drinking water, water for industry, water for agriculture across, large chunks of Han majority northern China. That's enabled China to achieve a pretty envious position in that China imports less than 1% of its water nationally, which if you think about a country with 1.3 or 1.4 billion people with a desert in the middle of it, that's quite impressive. And the hydrology engineering projects that they've been able to undertake in that region is a large part of that. And I think that also, that also does feed into sometimes what may seem to be a very sharp, maybe you could even argue, overly aggressive response from the PLA sometimes on the border, because there is this consideration that bakes into it. Conversely, India imports roughly 1/3 of its water, just as a point of comparison. So I think, the situation in the Taiwan Straits, India can make contributions, and they do. But I think not to be too dismissive, but it's not massively consequential. But I think the situation in regards to the border and to the broader Tibet region, I think that's where there are many more free variables. And I think that's where the situation requires a lot more careful thought, because frankly speaking, I think that's the specific location where things could go sideways quite quickly over what many would think would be relatively small issues, because there's so much dry powder in the background.
Thanks, Ryan. I mean, Dr. Lina, there's one question that when we talk about, one China, two China, that kind of stuff, I think it's quite explosive. But this is the question to you specifically. Do you think the nature of India-US relationship that is emerging, is that one of the major factors? I think you touched on it in your initial presentation, but can you say something from the Chinese perspective, how the China's worsening relationship with the US intersects with India's expanding relationship with the US at this point of time? Of course, US-China relationship is much bigger, much larger on the economic front than India's will ever be in the near term or even for the foreseeable future. So how does the strategic side, the intersection take place?
Well, my take on this is, I talk about different explanations. One of the explanations is China wants to deter India, to contend with the rise of India, to deter India from getting closer to the United States. That was one of the explanations. That's why China decided to create this border crisis, to contain India, which doesn't make sense to me. Because I think the Chinese approach is to stabilize relations with India, not to push India to the side of the US. So in that sense, it doesn't make any sense to create a border crisis to do that. It doesn't contain, it doesn't deter. It only pushes India to the side of the US. So it doesn't explain. But basically, I don't think this crisis is about has a strategic aim, a larger grand strategic aim. I don't think so. It's a localized, institutionalized. I guess it's the POA that pushes for this issue. The issue was defined by the POA analysts. They drive the policy. it's a, Chinese policy process is very stovepiped. It's all happening within the chain of command of the POA. It probably goes up to the Central Asia Commission. Xi Jinping goes along with it because he's obsessed with the issue of sovereignty. I mean, which makes sense. Except the interagency, civil military interagency process is terrible in China. I don't think the foreign ministry knows anything about PR troops being forward deployed to the line of actual control. I don't think they know anything about what's going on the ground. So that's the problem. So there's no larger picture. There's no larger picture taking into consideration of, containing India, to keep India from getting closer to the United States. But the objective is to keep India, to keep this relationship between China and India stable, to stabilize the relationship. That's why, got all these summits, Xi Jinping goes to India back in October, only a few months ago. Modi came to Wuhan, that was a couple of years ago, right? I mean, so, Xi Jinping visited India, a couple of times back in 2014, right? I mean, the trade figures go up close to $90 billion US. That's a lot of trade. Sure, I mean, China has more deficit, I mean, has more trade surplus, I mean, so China probably benefit more. But, in the long run, who knows? In the long run, it's not give and take, you play the iterative game rather than a single game. Eventually, India benefits from the trade, right? I mean, so in that sense, I don't see, but, again, I mean, I think the US-China security competition is inevitable simply because of the emerging bipolarity. I mean, the issue is the size of the economy and the expenditure on the defense. They're getting close. So China is $14 trillion US as opposed to the US 20 trillion. After the COVID-19 crisis, US GDP might shrink, right? But China may continue to grow, except the percentages. So the gap is narrowing between US and China. That exacerbates the insecurity of the US. US now decides to contain China. So that's inevitable.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
India, I mean, it's a different story. I mean, I think India should focus on the economy. That's my opinion.
Thank you, Dr. Linan. I think one last question. I think we're beginning to run into time, and I don't want to detain all our large audience that we have today. I think there are a lot of questions. I mean, I think one, can the business communities play a role in that is India and China to help kind of stabilize the situation? You talked about Chinese businesses around the world. There is also the question about, look, once, there is always the question of tomorrow, as Dr. Linan pointed out. In the end, there is the compulsion of economic growth, the logic of the size of the Chinese economy. So given all this, how do you see, can it be repaired? One, that is, not much damage has been done yet, as you said, but is there a role that the business communities can play that look, to nudge India and China to say, look, let's move in a positive direction?
I think the business community can, but within the business community, I'd specifically highlight the role that relatively young, new generation entrepreneurs can play in this regard, where the synergy between Indian and Chinese finance, technology, innovation is that much more. If that community comes together, converses together, it is quite possible to move forward in a relatively constructive fashion.
Okay, I think we've almost come to we have actually crossed over the time. I really want to thank all the four panelists, I think, for touching on so many interesting issues. But I really believe that it's premature to say the last word on this, but I think it's important for all of us to track this, that the views that, look, there's an inflection point, or there are others who think, look, there can't be any big structural change in the India-China relationship in the near term. But I think this clash in Galwan has actually triggered some fresh thinking, at least on the Indian side, and whether this will play out into something bigger, is something that we need to watch. And we looked at the motivations on both sides. I mean, I'm with Dr. Linan when he says, look, things don't, we can impose rationality sometimes on things the way that happen. We know there is a certain history, there's a certain context, but every decision can be, or every major, even incident, can it be framed, can it be shoehorned into a grand design? I think our job as analysts is to look for those patterns, but sometimes the chaos of government, particularly in large countries, as Dr. Linan was saying, look, not everybody knows what not every hand knows what other hand is doing, or not every finger knows what the other finger is trying to do. So there is that chaos at a lot of levels. But then the problem, of course, once an event happens, then it generates a political dynamic of its own. And that's where the question of leadership comes, of saying, look, for both India and China, economic growth should be the priority. For both the framework that both sides identified, which both sides keep citing even today, differences should not be allowed to turn into disputes. That India-China relationship is a positive relationship between India and China is good for the stability of Asia and the world. So these are self-evident truths, and that's where leadership comes in. Can they manage the consequences of this crisis, treat it as an aberration, and then say, look, okay, let's go back to a different framework, and how do we try and reduce some of the misunderstandings that have come? So that is the optimistic scenario. But on the pessimistic side, if things go out of hand, if things don't get fully restored, or if one side or the other feels it needs to do more in retaliation, then I think we could get into an escalation which neither side bargained for. And that's part of the tragedy of politics between nations through history. So there is always that danger, I think, we need to talk about. But I think this is a subject that is, as we said, intersecting with the larger dynamic that is unfolding in Asia, whether it is the pressure on globalization and regional integration on the one side, whether it is the breakdown of the last 40 years of relative harmony among the major powers, the absence of major conflicts in the region, and that period, is that coming to an end? So this makes it important for us to keep tracking this important issue and how it relates to other developments in Asia. So I want to conclude by, besides thanking the four panelists, I want special gratitude for Professor Bert Hoffman and the East Asia Institute and their colleagues for working with us for letting this first event between East Asia and South Asia Institutes in Singapore to come together and to look at the issues. As I said earlier, this will not be the last time. So both Bert and I are eager to do things together to explore China's impact on South Asia, India's impact on East Asia, and the dynamic intersection that is beginning to emerge between the two regions. And I think we are well placed in Singapore to reflect on these issues and to take this to larger audiences in the subcontinent and in East Asia. So to thank again Professor Bert Hoffman and the EAI for working with us, and my own colleagues here who made this happen. And to all of you who joined us this afternoon here in Singapore, please do stay with us and look at both the websites, the East Asia Institute website, ISA's website. There's a lot of interesting things that we do, and we look forward to continue to engage with you. So thank you all. Have a good evening and have a good day. See you all. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.